And we're going to carry straight on with our next session, which is going to dive down into the social implications of the energy transition. I guess climate finance takes us a little bit into that direction. A hugely important topic in light today, in particular with energy prices doing what they are doing. And of course, as we heard in the very beginning and Dr. Franke's opening remarks, and we saw it also in the latest Blueprints survey, most people are not actually prepared to pay any more, although they do support the energy transition. So for this next panel, we have a mix of real or physical and virtual speakers. I'd like to invite up Sjoerd Amerlaan and Fabian Rietz, who should both be here in person normally. And then we have Dr. Frank Mastiot and Felix Mailleux, who are joining us virtually, I believe.
Good afternoon.
The slides are skipping ahead of us. We're not quite that far yet. If we could go back another one. Well, whilst we look for the relevant slide, whether we have it or we don't, the subject for the next discussion is a deep dive into the social implications of the energy transition. For many of us, we call that the just transition. And I think for me as a journalist, when I write about it, that means everything from empowering and engaging people to take an active part in the transition to affordability, energy access, energy prices, jobs and skills. The regional impacts, often these are very different depending on whether you're a coal region or energy intensive region, whatever you might be. Also issues like diversity and equity, and finally public acceptance, which came up earlier this morning too as one of the big challenges, getting permission and so on to actually build renewables, for example, one of the big challenges that will need to be resolved here in Germany, but also elsewhere going forward. So we were meant to have Angela Wilkinson, the CEO of the World Energy Council, joining us today. Unfortunately, she's unwell. She's lost her voice, which is a particular problem since she was supposed to be speaking. And therefore, Sjoerd Amerlaan has kindly offered to replace her. He's usually based in the Netherlands, but is regional manager for Europe at the World Energy Council, and previously worked at the New Energy Coalition in the Netherlands, an organization working to drive forward the energy transition there. I'm just wondering, do we have our two online speakers? Are they with us? Just because I don't see them on the screen before I introduce them, just to make sure they're actually here.
I am here. I don't know if you can hear me. Felix Mailleux speaking.
We can hear you.
Felix Mailleux speaking here.
Ah, yes, we can see you. So.
Okay. Frank Mastiot here as well from Germany. Good afternoon.
Okay, good afternoon. So we have Felix, who you can see at the moment, Felix Mailleux, who's here from the European Trade Union Confederation, where he works on climate, energy, and industrial policies. Previously worked as an energy policy expert in Brussels, and here to bring in something of the workers' employment skills dimension of the energy transition. The other online speaker, can we get an image of Dr. Frank Mastiot? Is that possible? Yes, there we go. Welcome to you as well. So Frank is the CEO of Energie Baden-Württemberg, EnBW, Germany's third largest energy company, and he's been heading it up for nearly 10 years now. Previously worked for BP and Aon, and for taking on the position he is in now. So here to bring us the perspective of a big energy company and how, I suppose, the social dimension works its way into your daily business decisions as much as anything else. And finally, Fabian Rietz, here with us physically, co-founder and CEO of Everyone Energy, which is a Berlin-based tech startup created to empower people to take part in the energy transition through the use of digital technologies, which I think is an increasingly interesting area. and one that can hopefully, well, it's one of the tools we can talk about in the context of enabling a fairer, more equitable energy transition. So a warm welcome to you all. I thought we could kick off with you, Sjoerd. Social, so the World Energy Council has created an overarching theme called humanizing energy, which is, for me at least, basically about the human parts, the social bit of the energy transition. And that's, if I'm not mistaken, the kind of guiding principle for the next couple of years of work that you're doing. So I thought it would make sense to kick off by you kind of explaining from your perspective, what is humanizing energy, and why has it been given such a prominent place in the current work agenda?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sonja, for your kind introduction. Und meine Damen und Herren, ich möchte auch gerne zuerst sagen, dass es mich sehr freut, hier in Berlin zu sein heute. Und vielen Dank dafür auch für an die Weltenergie Deutschland für die Einladung hier zu sprechen. And switching back to English, I should also say that our Secretary General very much regrets not being able to contribute to the event today. But coming back to your question, Sonja, about why is it important to humanize the energy transition? Well, you would only have to look at the news headlines today about, the prices of energy, affordability, energy poverty, even in richer countries such as Germany or the Netherlands, where I'm from. And I'm almost inclined to say, here's the answer to your question, why it is important to humanizing energy. But I would like to make it a little bit more illustrative, even more. So let's just think about the average German household. Gunther and Ingrid, for example, living in a medium-sized town, average level of income, average level of education. Now, Gunther and Ingrid are support of the energy transition. They see the climate urgency. They want to play their part. And so this is why they're interested in exploring alternative sources for their energy supply, for example. So they're looking at options to, should we consider taking a heat pump? Should we consider taking solar panels on our roof? Should we install a small scale battery? But of course, there's a huge investment component involved, and they're not really quite sure what combination of things really works for them. Same for the idea of perhaps retrofitting their house and making it more energy efficient. Now, Gunther and Ingrid are also quite keen to change their behavior and to change their energy use, for example, but they struggle to understand, the energy terminology and all the information about their data use and the metering, for example, and how all these smart appliances work in their household. They're willing to place solar panels on their roof, but they're finding that they are struggling with the limits of regulation and rules, and they're also not quite sure if the incentive schemes actually quite work for them. There's a coal-fired power plant near the village, and Gunther and Ingrid are quite happy that they have announced to close that power plant in 2 years. But it also means that many of the jobs of their neighbors who are actually connected to the power plant might be lost. What is the energy future for these people, and how can their skills still be relevant in the energy future? At the same time, the municipality is considering building a huge wind farm at the edge of the village, right in the backyard of Gunther and Ingrid, and this is of course something that they're not really happy about. So they're looking for ways to make their voice heard in this process. And finally, last but not least, the new energy bill just landed on the doormat last week. And it says that the monthly amount that they will be paying will actually be triple the amount that they're paying now. So, I mean, perhaps this example is a little bit exaggerated, but on the other hand, I think you might agree it is to an extent really exemplary of what is happening in many places. And I think if you zoom out a little bit more, what we're actually seeing here is that Gunther and Ingrid are navigating the energy transition. And over the course of the 100-year history of the World Energy Council, we've seen these technology changes. We've seen the change from burning wood to use of coal and oil, for example, then the electrification, then the use of gas, now the use of renewables. And every time where you see this technology changes, there is a severe societal impact that goes with this. And it is important that we manage this process well. We basically need the Gunters and the Ingrids to be on board in these types of processes, because if we don't manage them well, they might opt out in this process, and we don't arrive at the stage where we want to arrive at. And this is, of course, not only true for Gunter and Ingrid, but it's also true for João and Aldina in Mozambique, or for Li and Wang in China, or for Joe and Sharon in America. So we really need to make sure that these people are involved in those processes, to make sure that they are energy literate, that they are active, that they are able to play their role, that they do have the skills, that there is an energy future also in terms of their jobs. And so really, when we're thinking about making a clean, affordable, sustainable and resilient energy future, of course we need new policy designs, of course we need new institutional frameworks, of course we need all the technologies that we can use, but we really should make sure to not forget to connect people and planet into this process. And that is really essentially what humanizing energy is all about. It's about people and planet at the same time.
And to what extent do you think, I guess, the global community, and I'm thinking both policymakers, but also businesses, acknowledge this, are aware of this, and are actually putting the citizen at the center? Because ostensibly, also, European energy policy, the citizen is at the center. As you say, that's perhaps not, reflected in reality. So,
well, to an extent, of course, there's always a difference between all the frameworks in place and reality on the ground. But I think, and also listening to the previous two speakers, for example, the conclusion is really that there's a lot more awareness now, I think, about the societal aspects of the energy transition and the importance of that. And if I may use an example, for example, of the work that we are doing at the World Energy Council as well, and speaking to this audience, you might be familiar with that, but every year we publish what we call the World Energy Issues Monitor. It is basically a survey among energy leaders globally, from government, from business, about what they consider to be the action priorities, what keeps them awake at night and what keeps them busy at work. So over time, this Issues Monitor gives a snapshot, gives an idea of the development of the energy agenda. And if you look at this year's results, it is really obvious that the societal aspects of the energy transition are coming much more to the fore prominently compared perhaps to the past. Energy affordability being number one, but also things like energy skills, the importance of activating consumers and what have you. And another survey that we did earlier this year in the context of the post-pandemic sort of scenarios, the work that we did, asked a question to the energy leaders. What do you think is the biggest challenge of reaching the Paris Agreement targets? And the answer globally and in Europe was the same. I don't know if you wanted to have a guess. It's insufficient behavior change. So in other words, consumer behavior was seen as the #1 challenge in reaching the Paris Agreement goals. Another question asked, what do you think is the role of the energy consumer nowadays in the energy system? And how do you feel this role should be? The importance of consumers being more active? In Europe, 50%, so half of the respondents said, well, the role of the consumer nowadays is probably low to very limited. Whereas at the same time, 70% actually acknowledge that this role should be a lot more prominent and a lot more significant. So I think really all these examples are token of the same idea that there's increased awareness of the societal impacts of the energy transition and humanizing energy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing in those examples. Let's turn then to a company. So Dr. Frank Mastio, you have to, I guess you're also obviously aware of the social implications, but you run an energy company. So how does this dimension, how do you take on board this dimension in what you do in your job with your company?
Yeah, good afternoon from this end, and thank you for being able to make a few introductory remarks for the conversation. As an energy company, you're intrinsically linked to all what's going on in society. That means you have a very ongoing direct dialogue with many stakeholders. So the question you're asking is what's the impact on their job, behavior, role, etc., and in vice versa on us. Simplest way to look at this is by obviously moving from, okay, there is a human-based impact on climate. Now everybody recognizes this. Lots of undeniable drastic effects this year have happened. So people come into this let's execute mode. And that means predominantly that we're going to see a pretty much a transition shift again in the entire energy system. The German word Energiewende is a transition of the energy system. Next one will be transition of the mobility system. Next one will be transition of the gas system by bringing in hydrogen into the equation. So the first thing is to understand this is quite a fundamental transition affecting everybody. If you look at the different stakeholders one by one, you can say governments, obviously, first and foremost at an international level, and we're going to see this in Glasgow very soon, there is a consistent advocacy to have and the determination of what is to be done collectively at an international level. That's the external perspective. The internal perspective, i.e. domestic policy, is manage all regulatory, fiscal, legal aspects of the transition into areas like education for the jobs you need for making this transition a reality. So university, primary schools, all the rest of it. And importantly, be aware of the tensions that have been mentioned beforehand. So carefully mention the societal, social, ideological tensions that exist to make sure that that the train doesn't jump off the track. If you look at industry, industry has to prepare, if not already in the midst of it, for a structural overhaul of business models. I can tell you for our business, that was quite a seismic shift that we underwent over the last 10 years, exit of nuclear in our country, exit of coal in our country, the booming emergence of renewables completely changed the business model. Just to put this into perspective, where 80% of our revenue stream was fossil fuel-based energy production, and 61% of that was nuclear. And you can imagine that has a dramatic impact on how you redirect your asset base, your skill base, your revenue streams. And we did this, and it took us almost 10 years to get there. But industry overall has to accept that, and this is a point very often overlooked. There is a whole raft of people in a company who has worked there for 30 years, and it's their life biography at question, saying, okay, seemingly I did something wrong in the last 30 years by working in a coal-fired power plant. If you want to convince them to get on the track of helping the transition, and that is a mental issue and a cultural issue which is bigger than it appears in the public debate, I can tell you. Technology plays a role, and importantly, a willingness to engage in different types of alliances. The predominant system of the past for the stakeholder industry was, I'm in my industry, I do this by myself, maybe I do a joint venture with somebody I know, but I'm not used to do joint ventures across industry borders, and that will definitely change going forward. If you look at the next stakeholder, which is communities and municipal sector, they at the end of the day have to make sure that the change in urban infrastructure, the change in the way in a village or a town or city is supported by energy is just changing, and that this change is happening on the grassroots level. That's a lot of stuff to debate with the people in town, with the regulator, and importantly helping that all citizens and people are aligned around the overarching society goal of climate change, which, as everybody knows, the moment it comes to the doorstep of an individual, becomes a very different conversation. People generally sign up for a green direction of energy, but the moment you put a wind farm in front of their nose, some of them will change their mind very quickly. Financial institution, second last, they just have to create a framework being able to support the huge investment which goes into trillions, just if you look at our country. So they're efficient funding solutions that have to be able to keep pace with the pace of investment that will accelerate. So the past was just a starting point of a transition. I believe by the numbers we are all aspire to, the velocity of speed will just increase. Finally, citizens and individuals, it has been mentioned, they have to get along. There is a recognition to have that says, if I say no and my neighbor says no and the neighbor of the neighbor says no to a wind farm, there will be no wind farm. And that is a real dilemma to, I repeat myself, to boil down a societal goal to the buy-in of somebody who is at the personal level. And finally, 2 final points. It is, in my view, the goal and the art to create a consistent story by everybody of those mentioned stakeholders, to repeat it over and over and over again in society. This is to be repeated 200 times, not 3 times. And it's not enough to write a book or a one-pager. You have to repeat it day in, day out to people so that they get used to the idea. And very often a showstopper, and that came through in the comments beforehand on the household bill, very often the showstopper is, this is so costly and so immensely expensive. It goes into trillions. That's one way to really disillusion everybody from the outset. If you throw numbers at people where they feel like, I have no idea what this number means, the only thing I can say, it seems like a burden a country cannot manage. In my view, this is a perspective that needs to be changed by simply saying, if, for example, €1 trillion is to be spent in a country, somebody will write the bill, the invoice. And it is important to make sure that the people who are affected by the cost, if you like, are enabled to be those who can write the invoice. What I mean by that is industry, small businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises, entrepreneurship, they all need to be mobilized that they are the ones who write the invoice, not somebody who is remotely apart 10,000 miles away, such that not only does it feel expensive, but also the wealth is redistributed somewhere else. So making sure that the buy-in of people is also used by the lever called economic participation is, for me, a fundamental thing where the societal impact can be buffered quite drastically, not entirely, of course, but we shouldn't underestimate the power of that conversation. So far, my views on your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and very interesting. Yeah, the last point. So economic participation is key to these broader issues of I suppose of feeling, of empowerment, of feeling a part and taking an active part in the energy transition. Let's turn to Felix then. Felix Maillot, as I said here, from the European Trade Union Confederation. What, from your perspective, are the biggest social challenges to address? Or maybe we can make it more specific, and then you can say something about which bits of the energy transition you think pose the greatest challenge in terms of jobs and skills.
First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and discuss with you. And perhaps before to answer your question, let me start by the obvious, is that climate change is here and now. And we know that the climate-related events are getting more intense and more frequent over time. And they put at risk the jobs actually and the lives of many European workers in Europe. So for that reason, the European Trade Union Confederation strongly welcomes and supports the ambitious climate action and the new climate targets proposed in the European Green Deal. It seems to be a bit trivial to state that, but I think it's important to remind it in the context of these rising energy prices and the debates around in the EU. For trade union, the only possible answer to the question how to move to climate neutrality by 2050 is through a just transition. The transition must be just both in terms of output, which means reducing inequalities and improve the well-being of citizens and workers, but also in terms of process. And it means that the workers and the people affected need to be involved in the design and implementation of the solution. If the transition to a climate neutral and circular economy will bring new opportunities across Europe, it will also bring new social and labor challenges. And we as trade union can identify 6 main ones that we will have to overcome collectively. The first challenge is that the new jobs that will be created in green industries will not automatically coincide geographically with the jobs that will be lost in other sectors, such as coal, fossil fuel industry, but also the automotive sector, which represent a lot more workers in the EU. This means that some regions will benefit a lot from the green transition with new jobs and new growth opportunities, while some others will suffer from negative impacts and will require support. And for those regions, it's essential that Europe provide adequate financial support, financial solidarity between regions and countries, as well as sound industrial policy to create alternative job opportunities. When designing these industrial policy, it's also important for us not to oppose green industries versus brown industries, because indeed, in order to build offshore windmills, solar panel, or to renovate buildings, we will need a lot of steel, aluminium, and cement, which are at the moment produced by industries that are highly energy intensive. And to make sure that these industries and their workers have a future in Europe, we need to invest massively in innovation and in the development of low carbon technologies, such as hydrogen, renewable, batteries, CCUS, but also technologies like semiconductor, etc. We should combine this with adequate trade mechanisms to ensure a fair competition environment also in the outside, for example, with a new CBAM and public procurement revision. A second challenge for us is that the new jobs created in this transition will not automatically coincide with the current skills of the workforce. We cannot ask a coal miner to turn from one day to another into a construction worker or windmill technician. So every worker should have a right to quality training and continuous lifelong learning. And we need to provide these training programs, but also the social protection needed during the transition period. The third challenge that we see is that it's not yet guaranteed that working conditions in green jobs will be as good as in those highly unionized traditional energy intensive sectors. To take an example, building renovation is often praised to create many new local jobs. This is true. However, for the moment, many of those jobs are characterized by low wages, bad working conditions, 0-hour contract, and social dumping. And for that reason, we need to ensure that the creation of quality job is also at the core of any climate transition. The fourth challenge, and I think we tackled this a little bit in previous discussion, is that climate policies such as carbon taxes can have strong regressive distributional effects on citizens. And if nothing is done to mitigate these effects, the climate transition will affect proportionally more those low-income households. It could also increase energy poverty across Europe. So to be socially acceptable, the Green Deal and climate policies should therefore ensure a fair redistribution with progressive taxation at its core and protection for low-income households. The fifth challenge is that besides mitigation, climate change consequences will also and already impact citizens and workers in many ways. I come from Belgium. You've seen probably the recent flooding that happened, and many companies were actually impacted by this, as well as public service workers like firefighters, civil protection, etc. So for us, it's important also to think in terms of adaptation measures and to involve those workers and to make sure that they are protected against the effect. I will maybe close my intervention with the last challenge that may actually come from ourselves, because every transition process brings its share of fear and uncertainty. And in those conditions, it can be tempting to advocate for the status quo in order to avoid difficult decisions. It's therefore a high risk that within our society, within our own organization of movements, some of us that are more affected prefer to adopt a passive attitude or to oppose when discussing more stringent policy, especially in the current context of rising energy prices. And we've seen this with some countries already at the EU Council. So if we want to offer a future to European workers, it's crucial that we as trade union, but also as you as other stakeholders, support ambitious climate action we also need to get involved and negotiate just transition plans also at company level. And here I'm happy to be able to talk to company representative. It's a real call to you to make full use of social dialogue and collective bargaining to develop jointly with your workers solution to ensure a just transition. I hope I wasn't too long in this introductory remark, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think it was very clear the 6 points you named. And we can see, I encourage people to send in questions if there are any, or if you're in the room to think of one. We'll have a moment, we'll be able to take some of those in a moment. So thank you, Felix. Let's turn to Fabian then, our final speaker and someone who's here in the room with us. As I said, co-founder and CEO of Everyone Energy, a tech startup here in Berlin. And I think, I mean, looking at your background, the obvious question is, how can tech help us deal with some of these social challenges of transition?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So first of all, I'm actually always a careful fan of digitalization only. So I always look at the solutions that are proposed, about potentials they pose, but also about threats they might bring with us. But first of all, let me talk about how digitalization changed a couple of areas of our daily lives. Take, for example, dating, shopping, the way we receive information, the way we socialize. Those are all areas of our life that were completely turned upside down within the last 10 years through digitalization. Just a couple of months ago, I found myself on the outskirts of Berlin, having a meeting there to talk about a photovoltaic array on a house roof. And then I needed to go to the next meeting, and it was not enough time to take public transport, and I looked for a car sharing car. And I found one just around the corner, but it was with a company I was not registered for already. So I just tried, okay, let's give this a try and register for this new company. And I was completely overwhelmed how seamless this whole process was. Within 5 minutes, I had a car. I was sitting in the car driving to my meeting. My driver's license was checked. My payment details were already registered. And it was just a great user experience. And I thought, hey, well, why don't we have something like that within the energy business? Within the energy business, for most of the companies, the solution providers out there, a consumer is barely more than an ID of a meter in the cellar, and that is something I think needs to change dramatically. And I think it was a great example with Ingrid and Gerd? No, what was it? Günther. Ingrid and Günther, because pretty much you already gave the pitch for why we need something like Everyone Energy. And that is, Ingrid and Günther, they do have the intention to change something. They try to navigate their way through all the hurdles that are put in front of them. May that be, what kind of technology should I use? How can I be compliant with regulation? What do I have to do? And they are probably, most likely, not energy economists by training, but something else, and that is completely okay. And you talked about terminology as well, and I think, within our research, we found that the vast majority of all projects that might become something we call a sustainable project, or something that turns normal citizens into active energy citizens, dies with the first Googling of what to do. Because you get overwhelmed with information, with what is possible. Everyone has a different opinion. You end up in forums where misinformation or bad information is happening. And that is something where we say, okay, that we call that the user experience valley of death. Because that is something you have to bridge between people who want to become active and the solution providers that actually help them to put the heat pump in their cellar or the photovoltaic array on their roof. And that is when we started Everyone Energy. So what we do is basically, we take all those questions you need to answer in order to navigate your way through knowing what is my way of energy transition, my personal individualized way with how I live, how my financials are, how my preferences are. And we put that into a big digitalized decision tree and just put a user interface above that that guides you through the whole process without any special terminology, without the language we use within the room here, but with a humanized language. We take you by the hand, we have a look at what are information we can source somewhere else and what do we have to ask you. So for example, the first thing we found out is that people have a lot of difficulty quantifying data about their rooftops. They don't know the angle exactly, and it's like, yeah, okay, I don't really know how big it is. They don't have a feeling for that. So first thing we did is we automized that. And what we have now is some kind of seamless user interface that guides you through this whole process. And we started with a use case that is very, very difficult, because we thought, okay, we can derive easier use cases from that, which is putting solar on multi-tenant buildings in Germany. And that is pretty much the hardest thing you can do in energy regulation when it comes to the details of that. And we now have a process that takes you about 10 minutes, that doesn't need any expert vocabulary. And you end up with a concept of, okay, in my situation, this is the best thing I can do, this technology, this will cost me approximately this much. Here are 5 companies that can help me with that, and those are the next steps I have to undertake. And the goal is to actually automate as much as possible, because when we talk about pledges being made at the COP or at the governmental level, in the end, when we want to take those pledges seriously, there's only one KPI that really matters, and it is how many projects can we realize? How many photovoltaic arrays can we put on the roofs? How many heat pumps can we put in the cellars? And that is something we need to turn up, and we can't do that with solutions that are not scalable by design. So we have to automate that. We cannot do that with people sitting in an office and waiting for citizens to come in to talk about photovoltaics. That is not the way we can achieve those numbers we actually need for that.
And to do what you do, is that, as you say, to automate as much as possible, is that then based also on bringing together people's data? I mean, in a sense, is that based on the use of artificial intelligence, that, you know, when you're guiding people through this process, it's based on, well, you know, if a million other people have to calculate their roof area, we can kind of tell you based on this, this, and this parameter, your roof is probably this size.
Yeah.
Is that how it works, or?
Not exactly. Okay. So I have to disappoint you. We neither use artificial intelligence nor blockchain. Okay. For some people that might be totally boring, but we found that the best way to tackle those problems is to talk with actual customers, with actual citizens, to talk to them, to build prototypes, to just watch them using them. So show, don't tell. Is one of the principles we use, which comes from design thinking, which is an innovation method. And a lot of the times it is to actually take the user journey and disassembling it into its tiny little parts, in which question is really useful at this moment, which order of questions, what do I have to ask the customer, and what can I somehow derive from different data. And we use a lot of data, obviously, not artificial intelligence as of yet, but we use, for example, a lot of open data on LiDAR data, which is a laser technology that actually scans all the roofs, and that can detect not only the size of the roof, but also the pitch. And that is something we use. For example, we use different APIs to data sources from third-party companies. So open data is a big plus for us. But there are also
Okay.
always holes in this open data field as well.
Okay. I propose we take another 10 minutes or so for questions, and then because we have quite a long coffee break coming up, and then we break for coffee. Are there any questions in the room to any of our 4 speakers? Or questions online? A mini essay has just come in. I'm going to have to take a moment to read that. In the meantime, I wanted to go back to Frank, perhaps, from ENBW. To come back to the internal transition you've undergone over the last 10 years, whether you can pull out any useful lessons for others who are undoubtedly going through similar transitions or looking to come out better on the other side, and perhaps how this putting the citizen at the center, how that's generating, because you said obviously it's changed the business model, what kind of new products that's giving rise to, and that makes it interesting for a company like yours to come out, to get through this, and to come out productively and lucratively at the other end.
This could be a lengthy answer to a short question, but I will make this a short answer to the short question. I try. There are a number of things that has worked in the transition. Number one, being clear that you are absolutely determined to move into this new horizon. And this is not a sort of interim phase in hope for a governmental positive monetary intervention or the old days come back kind of thing. One shouldn't underestimate the forces within the company and within industry that wish the old days back, and they glorify, etc., etc. And again, the life biography is something at stake of these people. So being very clear and absolutely relentless in saying we will move into the next phase, having a clear set of targets that underpin that, supporting people in their capability on the capability side of things, not having any blame game, as in how on earth could you not see this coming, and why are we in this mess, and why don't we have to restructure, etc., etc. At least in our case has worked very well. Just saying, okay, we are where we are, and there are enough smart people in the room who can pull us out. And then finally, I mentioned this before, the repeat. Even if you have a clear goal and a defendable case, intellectually finding it glorious and saying, I may have to repeat this twice or 3 times, underestimates the effort. You have to repeat it 100, 200 times again and again and again with a very consistent language internally and externally, until most people buying into the transition and giving everybody a fair chance to make a choice by saying, after a while, I've done my efforts to bring you on, but if this is not for you, we may have to depart. That is part of the honesty that this process deserves. And vis-a-vis the external world, using the same language as internally. The moment you are observed that you not saying what you do and not doing what you say is the end of a transition. People will stop doing the right thing. The consistency of the approach all the way through, even if it takes years, is of utmost importance.
Okay, thank you. Sjoerd, I wanted to come back to you as well. So we heard Fabian talking about, well, a way of actually on the ground getting people engaged, and he came back to your example of Gunther and Ingrid. Can you say a bit more, I guess, about the obstacles that you, or the research the World Energy Council has done, the obstacles you see to the humanizing energy agenda?
Yeah, I mean, sure. And I think in this discussion, we may actually have touched on quite a few of those already, and you know, it's too broad of a question to go into to address all these issues, and some of these, you know, these barriers and these obstacles are quite context specific as well, of course. But I think, you know, if you turn it around and if you think about enablers, it is very obvious that things like, you know, empowerment and energy literacy, making sure that people actually understand what is expected of them and, you know, understand energy is quite important, as is the, you know, the attention to skills and jobs and to also really make sure that we are putting in place, the enabling frameworks for people like Gunther and Ingrid and others, and their communities and their local energy stakeholders can really play their part. And if you think about because if they're not really involved, if they not feel engaged, there's really a risk that they may choose to really opt out, and then we may not arrive at the place where we want to be. And some people are kind of thinking about there is this silver bullet, or there is this moonshot technology that will solve all the puzzles. There really isn't. What it really requires is thousands of these smaller steps that need to be taken, locally, rooted in the local circumstances. And of course, as World Energy Council, we are trying to play our part here. We're not a network that prescribes what you should do. Rather, we convene our energy community around conversations about how you could do things. And so, for example, starting with our flagship event next year, the World Energy Congress, we are quite pleased to convene energy leaders around the theme of energy for humanity next year, and to have conversations about approaches and best practices, what works in the various parts of the world. We also launched recently an interesting initiative together with BBC Storyworks that brings stories about humanizing energy from all over the globe, inspiring stories about how people are dealing with energy. In the Europe region, we have a working group around humanizing energy where we are trying to organize a number of roundtable discussions on some of these topics. We're trying to look how we can, make our insights tools adaptable for people in the field, and how they might use them for thinking about new policy designs. So there's a lot we certainly can do to help, overcome some of these barriers.
Yeah.
May I add to that?
Yep.
Just a second. Because when you talked about Ingrid and Günther, you also mentioned the wind park being set up right at their doorstep. And I asked myself, how did this project come to life, the wind park? Because there was a big study of UC Berkeley, I think in 2019, that surveyed thousands of people living nearby wind farms and solar farms. And they came to the conclusion that actually it's not always the case that people are against it when it's in front of their doorstep, but it's a question of how were those people involved within the process.
Exactly.
And that is being involved in the process itself, in the planning, in all the phases. That's one factor of success, but also in the distribution of profits.
Yeah.
So when you have your local kindergarten being powered, but not only by green energy, but also being financed by the green energy from the wind park, it is a whole different story for the inhabitants of a village like that.
I totally agree, and it's a similar example from, for example, our member committee in Finland, where they really managed to turn around these conversations, just as you're saying, where by providing the right sort of incentives and engaging with the people on the ground, the resistance against something like this big wind farm in the backyard actually turned into a support for these types of developments. And so it's interesting examples.
Felix, I wanted to come back to you with, so the very long question we had in was basically a statement about the fact that the competitiveness ultimately of European products will be dependent on raw material costs, energy costs, and we're in competition with Asia for those. So Europe needs to think more broadly than just its own policies here. And I guess the question I wanted to put to you was, there is indeed always a lot of pressure on costs, labor, raw material, etc., which doesn't necessarily translate into good jobs. There was an article, I think in the FT today, which said, a green job could be making wind turbines. It could also be, I think the word was scrabbling around the hole for cobalt, which is what happens. So how do you see this tension, and how do we ensure that, the green jobs are good jobs, and, what's the role of the trade unions in that?
Yeah, but basically I agree with the comment made in the chat, and I think it's a point of attention that policymakers maybe should tackle a little bit more, especially the social dimension. The problem that we see sometimes is that when it comes to climate policies, especially the European institutions are able to set in stone hard law with legislation and regulations, for example, on standards on cars that the Commission is now proposing to ban the sale of new vehicles, basically ban combustion engine new vehicles by 2035. But at the same time, we don't see the same kind of hard law when it comes to social standard. And this is, to us, this is kind of a two-way speed where usually the Commission is providing only recommendation when it's about social dimension and hard law when it's about climate. The person in the chat used the example of the PV industry that was quite high in Europe 20 years or 15 years ago. And now when you look at the 10 biggest producer of PV, they are all Chinese and there is no European producer anymore. I think this example illustrates perfectly the need for a sound industrial policy at European level, and we shouldn't be afraid of discussing strategic autonomy and industrial policies in the EU. Let me take again the example of the car industry. We are now quite well advanced in the shift from combustion engine to electric vehicle, but we also know that producing electric vehicle require less workforce than combustion engine. So there is a whole social dimension there that needs to be addressed. And in parallel, we know that at the moment, the producers of batteries, semiconductors, and these kind of elements that are needed for electric vehicle are not located in the EU. So there is a real need for strategic thinking in the EU, at the EU level, and strategic autonomy. Perhaps one last word is also a call for the EU policymakers to make a better use of green public procurement in general, which represent around, I think it's around 16% of the EU's GDP. So it's a huge levy to make things change. And at the moment, Europe is not enough ambitious in the condition it fixes in its in its public procurement. And many of there is an unfair competition between the different parts of the world. And I think this should also be addressed to favor more fair and competitive environment, both in terms of environment and social standards.
Okay, thank you. Maybe to wrap up then, I haven't seen anything else come in, nor any questions in the room. A final question to you, Fabian, which is, do you specifically, I guess, target those that have the greatest difficulties? Because you're a company, presumably you also charge for your services. So how do you really help those that have, I guess, the least access to information, knowledge, decision-making, capacity, ability? Do you really target the disadvantaged? And if so, how do you do that?
Yeah, so we do not specifically target the disadvantaged, but we aim to provide a service for all citizens. So for all situations of life, for tenants, for people who own buildings, we want to roll out services. We started with people who live in multi-tenant buildings. That was the first step for us, the first product that's online. And within this space, we have two separate, let's call it, flows through this decision tree, which is one is for tenants and the other one is for people who own apartments, because they have also, again, it comes back to the user journey. They are quite different user journeys, but we plan to roll out our solutions for different products, for charging stations, for EVs, for batteries, for heat pumps, stuff like that, and also obviously for people who live in single-family homes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. I suspect Frank Mastio has had to go already, so I don't see him anymore. But a big thank you to him and to the two of you who made it here, and to Felix, of course, as well, back in Brussels, and to all of you who joined us virtually and here.